hard to define creativity, I feel. And to me, there are three key terms here. The first is imagination. Now, imagination to me is the wellspring of all of this. Imagination is the most extraordinary power. And so far as we can judge, only human beings really show it in anything like the degree that we do. I mean, other species may have imaginations, but it's not obvious in quite the same way. What I mean is the power to bring to mind things that aren't here in the present, things that aren't available to your senses. With imagination, you can revisit the past, and you have a past. And it's not just a single past, but there are many possible ways of rethinking the past. You have the ability to put yourself into other people's positions, to empathize with other people, to see it in their mind's eye. And you can visit the future. Not a single future, but many possible futures. I don't think you can predict the future, but you can envisage various possibilities of the future. And that's the most extraordinary power. I think almost everything that's distinctively human comes from that power. Creativity is a step on from there, because you could be imaginative all day long, but never do anything. You would never say of somebody that they're tremendously creative, but what would they do? Well, nothing. They just lay in bed all day. To be creative, you have to do something. It's a very practical process. In a way, it's putting your imagination to work. So I think of creativity as applied imagination. There's a more formal way to define it, which is the process of having original ideas that have value. And you can be creative at anything. That's my point. You can be creative at mathematics, at music, at art, at running a business, running a family. Anything is a possible source of fresh thinking. Innovation is the third term, and that, to me, is putting good ideas into practice. So a lot of companies are interested in innovation, and they're right to be, because the world is changing so quickly. They have to continue to innovate. But you can't go straight to it. To innovate, you have to have a process of creativity, and to have that, you have to be able to foster and encourage imagination. And that's where it goes wrong for lots of organizations. And I think for individuals, they stop nourishing their imagination. I've always been struck by this, that if you ask most adults if they think they're creative, surprisingly, they think they're not. I mean, ask at the next dinner party, and it's really surprising to me that most people don't think they're very creative and think that only special people are. But if you ask children if they think they're creative, they all do, up to a certain age. And there comes a point where people seem to lose confidence in their creativity. And I think there are lots of reasons for it. But one of them, I'm convinced, is education. I think that we're educated out of our creativity. That we reach a point through the process of education where imagination and fresh thinking is discouraged, where the emphasis is on getting the right answer, where the whole culture is about standardizing and testing. And people become frightened of making mistakes and being wrong. And I don't mean to say that being creative is the same thing as being wrong, but everybody knows that if you're trying to pursue original thinking, there are lots of false turns, there are lots of errors, lots of trials that don't quite work out. I remember speaking to a friend of mine once who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. I have not won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, and I was never very good at chemistry, but he clearly was. And I asked him one day how many of his experiments failed, and he said about 98% of them. But he said, of course, failure is not the right word. When you're trying new things, you're constantly experimenting to see what works and what doesn't. And being able to fail is an essential part of the process of encouraging creativity. And if you live in a culture, whether it's a school or a company, where you're frightened of failing, then innovation and creative thinking starts to be stifled and inhibited. So it's one big factor. There are others, but I think that's a big factor. So part of this is to deliberately encourage imagination, through subjecting yourself to new experiences, if I always say to adults, if you never go to an art gallery, go to one. If you've never been to a ballet, go and try one out. If you don't go to a sports event, go. If you always drive the same way to work, take a different way to work. But stimulating your imagination with a flow of ideas is the heart of that. Now, some companies have a very deliberate policy of doing that. I visited Pixar a while ago, and Pixar is a remarkably successful company in the field of animation. They I think, won Academy Awards for pretty much everything they've ever done. There are all kinds of reasons for it, but one of them is they have a very interesting culture. They have something at Pixar called the Pixar University, and that's a program of workshops, events, talks, seminars, which happen all day long on the campus of Pixar. What's really interesting about this is that everybody on the payroll at Pixar is entitled to spend 4 hours a week at the Pixar University, and they can do anything they want. It doesn't have to be related to their job, and it's not just the people in the animation studios, it's everybody. Well, it has several effects. One of them is that because anybody can go to anything, and these may be lectures on Egyptology or courses in archaeology or whatever, because anybody can go to anything, there's a constant flow of new ideas running through the organization. People's minds are kept alive by it, off the job and on the job. And the second thing is because anybody can go to anything, people are constantly running into each other from different parts of the organization. So it creates a bonding culture of the organization, a sense of a common culture. So it's a very deliberate way, I think, of keeping people's minds active. You look at other companies like Procter & Gamble, for example, who are in a whole range of products and commodities of various sorts. They have a very different strategy for innovation. They have a whole series of kind of innovation pods, where people come together from different parts of the organization, and often they work with agencies outside the organization. I was looking recently at Cisco Systems. John Chambers there was talking recently about his changing style of leadership at Cisco, which is a highly successful internet company, but they've now moved into these flip camcorders. What they deliberately do there is bring together cross-disciplinary teams. The whole emphasis is on collaboration. And this to me is really important, that creativity is about making connections, about seeing relationships, about opening up new possibilities. And if you have an organization, and it could be a school or a company, where all the different disciplines are kept separate from each other, where people only talk within their own specialism, it's much less likely that you'll get that sort of spark of innovation that comes from people comparing and exchanging ideas across the different fields of activity, the different disciplines. So a big bit of it for me, for leading a culture of innovation, is to recognize that real creative thinking isn't solo. It's not an individual performance. I don't mean it never is, but much more often, innovation and creative thinking comes from people collaborating, from working in teams. And it's one of the other ways, by the way, in which it gets stifled in education, because people are assessed as individuals rather than working collaboratively. And if you really want that spark of creative culture, it comes from the mixing together of people's ideas.